Mayflower, A Story of Courage, Community, and War, by Nathaniel Philbrick. Picture this. It's 1676, somewhere off the coast of New England. A ship cuts through the waves, but this isn't the famous Mayflower you learned about in school. This is the Seaflower, and instead of hopeful colonists sailing toward freedom, it's carrying 180 Native American men, women, and children bound for Caribbean sugar plantations as slaves. Here's the kicker. The man who signed off on this? Governor Josiah Winslow of Plymouth Colony. His parents came over on the original Mayflower. Wait, what? How does a story that starts with pilgrims seeking religious freedom and sharing turkey at the first Thanksgiving turn into this nightmare just 56 years later? That's exactly what Nathaniel Philbrick tackles in his brilliant book, Mayflower. And let me tell you, this is nothing like the sanitized version you got in elementary school. Philbrick, who won the National Book Award, strips away the mythology to show us something way more complicated, more disturbing, and ultimately more human. We think the Pilgrim story ends with that famous feast, but Philbrick argues that's actually where it begins. The real story is what happened over the next 50 years. The messy, complicated dance between two cultures trying to coexist. It's about how that fragile peace exploded into one of the bloodiest wars, proportionally speaking, ever fought on American soil. Today, we're diving deep into that story. We're going back to the very beginning of Plymouth Colony, really the beginning of America itself. And by the end, you'll see that the Pilgrims weren't the cardboard cutouts in funny hats we imagine. They were brilliant, flawed, brave, and sometimes cruel. In other words, they were human. Their story isn't just ancient history gathering dust. It's a mirror reflecting both the best and worst of what America would become. This isn't just the story we think we know. It's the story we need to know. Our journey begins not in America, but in the damp, gray farming villages of northern England, around 1600. Meet William Bradford, a sickly orphan who couldn't work the fields like other kids. Instead, he found companionship in the pages of the Bible. And those pages changed everything. King James I ran a tight ship back then. The Church of England was the only legal church, and everyone had to conform. But a growing movement called the Puritans thought the church had gotten corrupt and needed to be, well, purified, stripped of all the fancy ceremonies and robes. Within this movement was an even more radical group, the Separatists. They didn't think the church could be fixed. They wanted out completely, which was, by the way, totally illegal and dangerous. Young Bradford found his tribe in a secret group of separatists meeting in a town called Scrooby. For the first time, this lonely kid felt like he belonged. But in 1607, the authorities caught wind of them. Some went to prison. Others had their homes watched. Time to get out of Dodge. Their first escape attempt was a disaster. The ship captain they hired took their money, then promptly turned them in. On their second try, another captain panicked when he spotted the local militia and just sailed away. Picture this. Women and children crying on the shore while their husbands watch helplessly from a departing ship. Eventually, they reunited and made it to Leiden, Holland, a place that actually tolerated religious differences. They spent 12 years as refugees in Leiden. Safe? Yes. Easy? Not even close. These were farmers forced to work brutal hours in textile factories. Worse, their kids were becoming Dutch. The separatists had left home for their faith, but losing their English identity? That was too much. So they hatched a plan that was either incredibly brave or completely insane. They'd moved to the New World. Think about this for a second. Nearly every English colony in North America had failed. Jamestown, the one that survived, was a horror show. 70 out of 108 settlers died the first year. During one particularly grim stretch, called the Starving Time, 440 out of 500 people perished in 6 months. Plus, there were these terrifying stories about Native Americans who supposedly enjoyed flaying people alive with seashells. Why would anyone with children even consider this? Their answer was simple. They believed God wanted them to go. They saw themselves as modern-day pilgrims, on a divine mission to plant a godly English society in the wilderness. As Bradford later wrote, they knew they were pilgrims. Getting there turned into an absolute nightmare. A slick London merchant named Thomas Weston swindled them, changing their financial agreement at the last minute. They bought a small ship called the Speedwell to accompany the larger Mayflower, but the Speedwell leaked like a sieve. Turns out the captain, a guy named Reynolds, had deliberately sabotaged it, probably part of a Dutch plot to keep them away from their territory. After months of delays, only about 50 people from the original Leiden group remained, along with another 50 strangers, merchants, craftsmen, and servants recruited by London investors. On September 6, 1620, the Mayflower finally left England. For 65 days, 102 people, plus 2 dogs, endured a space between decks that was less than 5 feet high. Imagine being constantly seasick in a dark, airless room that reeks of vomit and human waste, with salt water spraying on your head from leaks above. Midway through, a massive wave actually cracked one of the main support beams. The captain considered turning back, but the Pilgrims used a giant screwjack, meant for building houses, to prop it back up. On November 9th, they finally spotted land, Cape Cod, way north of where they'd intended to go. The captain tried sailing south, but ran into a nightmare of sandbars and breakers off what's now Chatham. Seriously, half of all Atlantic coast shipwrecks happen in this area. With the wind dying and darkness falling, Captain Jones was trapped. At the last possible moment, the wind shifted and he escaped. Completely rattled, Jones made a decision that changed everything. They'd stay and settle in New England. This caused chaos on the ship. Some of the strangers argued that since they weren't landing where their charter said, the rules didn't apply anymore. Once ashore, they'd use their own liberty, for none had power to command them. The Pilgrim leaders did something remarkable. Instead of using force, they used an idea. They drafted a document where everyone agreed to combine ourselves together into a civil body politic and obey laws created for the common good. This document, the Mayflower Compact, was revolutionary, a government created not by a king or divine right, but by the people themselves. On November 11, 1620, 41 men signed it. Then they elected John Carver as their first governor. With that one pragmatic act, they saved the colony from falling apart before it even started. They anchored at what's now Provincetown Harbor. After months at sea, land should have been a relief. Instead, Bradford described it as a, quote, hideous and desolate wilderness. Winter was coming. In the next 4 months, half of them would die. They spent a month exploring Cape Cod's cold, sandy landscape, searching for a settlement spot. They had a scary encounter with natives who shot arrows at them from the woods. They also found buried baskets of Indian corn and took them, promising themselves they'd repay the owners someday. Spoiler alert, they eventually did. In mid-December, a small group got caught in a brutal storm. Their rudder broke, their mast snapped, and they nearly crashed onto a beach in the freezing dark. But they found shelter on a small island, and on Monday, December 11th, discovered a place with a protected harbor, running brooks, and cleared fields ready for planting. They'd found home. They called it Plymouth. But William Bradford's homecoming was devastating. His wife Dorothy had fallen from the ship and drowned in the harbor's cold water. He never wrote about her death, which makes it even more heartbreaking, especially since they'd left their 3-year-old son behind in Holland. The first winter was absolute hell. Disease swept through. At the worst point, only 6 or 7 people were healthy enough to care for the dying. They buried bodies at night in unmarked graves, so watching natives wouldn't know how weak they'd become. By spring, 52 of the original 102 passengers were dead. What they didn't know was that they'd landed in a ghost town. A devastating plague between 1616 and 1619 had wiped out about 90% of the native population along the New England coast. Plymouth was littered with sun-bleached skulls and bones of the Patuxet people who'd once lived there. The regional power player was Massasoit, leader of the Pokanockets. The plague had slashed his warriors from 3,000 to just a few hundred. Meanwhile, their rivals, the Narragansetts to the west, were untouched, and now way more powerful. Massasoit was desperate. When the Mayflower showed up, he didn't see a threat. He saw potential allies with powerful muskets who could help him against the Narragansetts. In March 1621, a tall, naked native man just walked into Plymouth and boomed, "Welcome, Englishmen!" His name was Samoset, and he'd learned English from fishermen up in Maine. A few days later, he brought back someone who changed everything: Squanto. Squanto's story is incredible. He was one of the last Patuxet survivors. In 1614, an English captain had kidnapped and sold him into slavery in Spain. He escaped to London, learned English, and finally got passage home in 1619, only to find everyone he'd ever known was dead. Squanto interpreted for Massasoit's first meeting with the Pilgrims. After formal ceremonies, Governor Carver and Massasoit agreed to a mutual defense treaty. If anyone attacked one of them, the other would help. It was an alliance born from mutual desperation, and it held for over 50 years. Squanto stayed with the Pilgrims, teaching them to plant corn using herring as fertilizer, and how to catch eels in the muddy tidal creeks. Bradford called him a special instrument sent of God for their good. But Squanto had his own agenda. He secretly played the English and Pokanockets against each other, telling tribes the Pilgrims kept the plague in barrels, and only he could stop them from unleashing it. His goal? Become the most powerful leader in the region. When Massasoit discovered the plot, he demanded Squanto's execution, but Bradford refused. He needed his interpreter too much. Fall 1621 brought a successful harvest. Bradford sent men hunting, and Massasoit showed up with 90 of his guys and 5 deer. For 3 days, English and Pokanockets feasted, played games, and fired muskets in celebration. This was the first Thanksgiving, not a somber religious affair, but a secular harvest festival and a genuine moment of relief and goodwill between two groups who'd somehow managed to survive against incredible odds. But this moment of peace was just the opening chapter of a much longer, messier story. The next 55 years were what Philbrick calls accommodation, a constant process of struggle, compromise, and negotiation. As long as both sides needed each other, peace held. Then the world changed. The 1630s brought thousands of new Puritan settlers to Massachusetts Bay. Plymouth went from being the center of the English world in America to a backwater surrounded by larger, richer colonies. Governor Bradford watched in dismay as his tight-knit community splintered, families moving away for more land. This land hunger crushed the native population. Massasoit, trying to maintain status and get English goods, tools, blankets, guns, started selling vast tracts of territory. Plymouth officials insisted every purchase was fair, but the system kept prices artificially low. Indians were slowly being pushed out of their own homeland. When Massasoit died around 1661 and Bradford a few years earlier in 1657, leadership passed to a generation that hadn't experienced those desperate early years of mutual dependence. The new Plymouth governor was Josiah Winslow, son of Pilgrim diplomat Edward Winslow. Ambitious and arrogant, Josiah represented a new English attitude that saw Indians not as partners, but as obstacles to prosperity. Massasoit's heir was his eldest son, Wamsuta, who took the English name Alexander. In 1662, Winslow heard rumors Alexander was plotting with the Narragansetts. He marched to Alexander's hunting lodge, burst into his wigwam, and, according to some accounts, held a pistol to his chest, forcing him to Plymouth for questioning. Shortly after, Alexander fell violently ill and died. His younger brother, Metacom, whom the English called Philip, was convinced Winslow had poisoned him. From that moment on, deep, personal hatred burned between the two men now leading their peoples. Philip was only 24 when he became leader. He was proud and tough, But he also knew his people were weak. For a decade he walked a tightrope, continuing to sell land while trying to resist colonists' ever-increasing demands. But the pressure was relentless. Colonial livestock destroyed native cornfields. The English legal system chipped away at native sovereignty. By 1671, Philip's young warriors demanded action. He began preparing for war but was forced to sign a humiliating treaty, surrendering his people's guns and acknowledging himself as a Plymouth subject. It was total capitulation, and it convinced Philip that peace was impossible. He began using money from his last land sales to secretly buy more weapons. The final spark came in January 1675. John Sassamon, a praying Indian, who had once worked for Philip but was now distrusted by him, warned Governor Winslow that Philip was preparing for war. Winslow dismissed it. Weeks later, Sassamon's body was found under the ice of a frozen pond. Now Winslow listened. He launched an investigation. An Indian witness claimed he'd seen 3 of Philip's senior men murder Sassamon. They were put on trial in Plymouth. Despite English law requiring 2 witnesses and having only one dubious one, a jury of 12 Englishmen and 6 praying Indians found all 3 guilty. On June 8, 1675, 2 were hanged. When the rope broke during the 3rd man's execution, the terrified prisoner confessed, providing the second witness they needed. A month later, he was shot. For Philip and his warriors, this trial was the ultimate insult, a gross violation of their sovereignty. No more talk. Young warriors, hungry for revenge, started pillaging English farms in Swansea, which bordered Philip's territory at Mount Hope. The shamans had predicted Indians would win if the English fired first. On June 23, an English boy shot and killed an Indian, looting his family's abandoned home. The war had begun. What followed was 14 months of unimaginable horror. King Philip's War engulfed all of New England, from the farthest Maine settlements to the Connecticut River Valley. This wasn't fought on open battlefields. It was ambushes, terrifying raids on isolated farmhouses, and brutal massacres. The English, trained for European-style warfare, were initially useless in New England's forests and swamps. The Indians, using what was called a skulking way of war, were masters of concealment and surprise. The first year, the native alliance was astonishingly successful. They torched town after town: Brookfield, Lancaster, Medfield, Groton, Sudbury. Captives like Mary Rowlandson, a minister's wife from Lancaster, endured what she called a, quote, grievous captivity. A third of all English towns in New England were burned and abandoned. There was even a proposal to build a wall around Boston and surrender everything else to Philip. But the English had advantages: larger food reserves, continuous supplies of arms and ammunition from England. The Indians were fighting while trying to feed their families. As the war dragged on, starvation became as deadly as the English. The turning point came with the Great Swamp Fight in December 1675. The powerful Narragansetts had stayed neutral, but paranoid English decided they couldn't be trusted. A combined army of 1,000 soldiers from Massachusetts, Plymouth, and Connecticut launched a preemptive strike on a massive, fortified Narragansett village hidden in a frozen swamp in Rhode Island. The battle was a bloodbath. The English suffered devastating casualties but burned the fort to the ground, killing hundreds of Narragansett men, women, and children. The attack pushed surviving Narragansetts into the war, but also destroyed their winter food supply, crippling them for months. This war also produced a new kind of American hero, Benjamin Church, a carpenter from Plymouth. He was one of few Englishmen who understood and respected native fighting methods. While other commanders refused Indian allies, Church built his company around them. He learned to move silently through woods, fight from cover, and think like his enemy. Summer 1676, Church convinced the Sakonay tribe, led by female leader Awashanks, to switch sides and fight with him. With his mixed company of English volunteers, and Sakonnet warriors, Church began turning the tide in Plymouth colony, hunting Philip relentlessly and capturing hundreds of his followers. Philip's end came August 12, 1676. Betrayed by one of his own men, Philip was trapped in a swamp at Mount Hope, his ancestral home. As he tried to flee, he was shot and killed, not by an Englishman, but by a Pocasset Indian named Alderman, whose brother Philip had recently executed for suggesting surrender. In a final act of desecration, Church ordered Philip's body beheaded and quartered. His head went to Plymouth, mounted on a pole on Fort Hill, a grim trophy that stayed on display for over 20 years. Philip's 9-year-old son and wife were sold into slavery, along with thousands of other Native Americans. The war was over, but the cost was staggering. Proportionally, it was more than twice as bloody as the Civil War. The Native American population of southern New England dropped by as much as 80%. The dream of two cultures coexisting was gone, replaced by a legacy of bitterness, fear, and racial hatred that would shape the country for centuries. The journey that began with one ship, the Mayflower, ended with another, the Seaflower. So what do we take from this powerful and often heartbreaking story? It's tempting to see these events as ancient history, disconnected from our lives. But Nathaniel Philbrick's great achievement in Mayflower is showing us this isn't just about the past, it's about us. The Pilgrim journey is the quintessential American story of reinvention. They left everything behind, searching for a new life where they could be free. But their quest for freedom ultimately led to conquering and enslaving another people. This is the central paradox of American history, a conflict between our highest ideals and darkest actions that we're still wrestling with today. What's compelling about Plymouth's first 50 years is that for a brief, shining moment, a different path seemed possible. The alliance between Bradford and Massasoit wasn't perfect, but it was real, built on mutual respect, mutual need, and willingness to do the difficult, frustrating work of diplomacy. They understood something their children forgot. Survival depended on their ability to accommodate each other. The tragedy of King Philip's War is the tragedy of lost memory. The second generation, both English and native, inherited the world their parents built, but didn't inherit the wisdom that came from building it. Josiah Winslow and his crowd saw Indians as an inconvenience, a roadblock to progress. Philip and his warriors saw the English as invaders who'd broken their promises. Both sides stopped listening. They began seeing each other not as complex human beings, but as one-dimensional enemies. And in that failure of imagination, war became inevitable. The great lesson of Mayflower is a lesson in empathy. It's a call to look beyond the simple myths we tell ourselves about who we are and where we came from. History is never as simple as heroes and villains. It's a messy, complicated, often tragic story of flawed human beings trying their best in difficult circumstances. The Pilgrims weren't saints, and the Native Americans weren't savages. They were people, bound together by shared geography and a shared, often painful, destiny. How can we apply this to our own lives? Start with a simple act. Question the stories you've been told. Think about your town's history, your family's story. What parts get celebrated? What parts are left out? Who are the heroes, and whose voices have been silenced? By seeking the full story, the complicated story, we honor everyone's humanity. Perhaps most importantly, we can learn from those 50 years of peace, not just the 14 months of war. Peace isn't a passive state, it's an active process. It requires patience, compromise, and courage to see the world from someone else's perspective. It's the hard, unglamorous work of listening, understanding, and recognizing that our survival is linked to others' survival. That was the hard-won wisdom of Plymouth's first generation, and it's wisdom we desperately need today. That was a summary of Mayflower, a story of courage, community, and war, by Nathaniel Philbrick. We've covered the main narrative today, but honestly, a summary can never capture the full power of a book like this. The real magic happens when you immerse yourself in the world the author creates. It's in the small details, the vivid descriptions of brutal winters, the raw emotion in a leader's voice, that the past truly comes alive. This overview gives you a foundation and helps you see if this is a story you want to explore more deeply. If anything we've discussed today has sparked your curiosity or challenged what you thought you knew, I encourage you to pick up a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's an experience that can genuinely change how you understand America's foundations and the timeless complexities of the human heart. If you found this journey valuable, please consider liking this podcast and subscribing to our channel. It helps us continue bringing these incredible stories to light and ensures you won't miss our next exploration of a book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's continue to learn and grow together.